Welcome to Bedtime Express, your journey into peaceful sleep through the power of storytelling. Tonight, we invite you to close your eyes and drift back more than 2,000 years to ancient Rome and the extraordinary tale of Spartacus, the gladiator who defied an empire. Before you fall asleep, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment telling us from where you are joining us, and subscribe to join us on future journeys through time. Your support helps us create more restful content for you. Over the next hours, you'll experience the complete story of the slave who became a legend, who led the greatest rebellion against Rome, and whose fight for freedom still inspires us today. This is a story of courage, determination, and the eternal human yearning for liberty. Now, settle into your most comfortable position. Adjust your pillows, pull up your blankets, and let the cares of the day fade away. Take a deep breath in and slowly release it. Let your body relax, let your mind grow quiet, and prepare to drift into peaceful sleep. Our story begins in the mountains of Thrace, where a young man would soon discover his destiny. So close your eyes now and let the journey begin. Spartacus, the gladiators' rebellion. In the ancient world, beneath the endless Mediterranean sky, there lived a man whose name would echo through the centuries. His name was Spartacus, and his story is one of courage, defiance, and the eternal human yearning for freedom. Close your eyes now and let us journey back more than 2,000 years to a time when Rome ruled the known world with an iron fist and when one man dared to challenge an empire. Our story begins not in the grand arenas of Rome, but in the rugged mountains of Thrace, a land of fierce warriors and ancient traditions. Thrace lay far to the northeast of Rome, where the Balkans meet the shores of the Black Sea. It was a land of dense forests and snow-capped peaks, where the wind howled through narrow valleys and the people were as hard as the granite beneath their feet. Spartacus was born into this harsh yet beautiful world, somewhere around the year 111 BCE. The exact details of his birth are lost to the mists of time, as they often are for those not born into privilege. History did not care to record the arrival of a Thracian baby, for Rome saw the Thracians as barbarians, lesser people on the fringes of civilization. But young Spartacus would prove that greatness knows no boundaries of birth or station. As a boy, Spartacus learned the ways of his people. He learned to hunt in the deep forests, to track deer and wild boar through the snow. He learned to fight, as all Thracian boys did, for his people were warriors by tradition and necessity. The Thracians had their own gods, their own customs, their own fierce pride in their independence. They worshipped Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, and Bendis, their moon goddess, who watched over them in the darkness. The young man grew strong and tall, with powerful shoulders and quick reflexes honed by years of training and survival. His eyes held the sharp intelligence of one who had learned to read the forest, the weather, and the intentions of men. He moved with the grace of a natural athlete, and his presence commanded respect even in his youth. Those who knew him spoke of his courage, but also of his compassion, a rare combination in those brutal times. When Spartacus came of age, he joined the Thracian auxiliary forces. This was not unusual, for many Thracian men served as mercenaries, selling their considerable fighting skills to various powers in the region. Some ancient sources suggest that Spartacus may have even served with the Roman military for a time, learning their tactics and discipline from the inside. If this is true, it would explain much about his later military genius. But fate had other plans for Spartacus. Whether through desertion from the Roman army or capture in battle, the details are unclear and debated by historians. What we know is that at some point in his early manhood, Spartacus found himself in chains. The proud Thracian warrior, who had roamed free through mountain passes and hunted under open skies, was now property. He was a slave, bound for the markets of the Roman Empire. Imagine, if you will, the long march from Thrace to Italy. Spartacus would have been shackled to other captives, a long chain of human misery trudging westward. Each step took him further from his homeland, from the mountains he knew, from any life he had imagined for himself. The sun beat down on them by day, and at night they huddled together against the cold, the chains never allowing them to forget their degradation. In Rome, slavery was the foundation upon which the entire society rested. Millions of slaves kept the empire running, working in fields and mines, in households and workshops. They were legal property, with no more rights than livestock. A master could beat his slave, sell his slave, even kill his slave with relative impunity. The Romans saw nothing wrong with this system. To them, it was simply the natural order of things. The slave markets of Rome were places of profound human tragedy. Men, women, and children stood on raised platforms while buyers examined them like animals, checking their teeth, testing their muscles, discussing their worth in cold commercial terms. Families were torn apart, children sold away from mothers, husbands separated from wives. The air in these markets hung heavy with despair, and the scent of unwashed bodies pressed too close together. For Spartacus, his physical prowess proved to be both a blessing and a curse. His strong build and obvious fighting skills caught the eye of a particular type of slave trader, one who dealt in a specialized and brutal form of entertainment. Spartacus was purchased to become a gladiator, a fighter who would shed blood in the arena for the amusement of Roman crowds. He was taken to Capua, a wealthy city about 120 miles southeast of Rome, famous for its gladiatorial schools. Capua was an ancient and prosperous place, with wide streets lined with elegant villas and bustling markets filled with goods from across the empire. But for Spartacus, it would become a place of rigorous training, harsh discipline, and the constant shadow of death. The gladiatorial school, or ludus, where Spartacus was taken, belonged to a man named Lentulus Batiatus. Batiatus was a lanista, a trainer and owner of gladiators, a profession that occupied a strange place in Roman society. Though lanistae could become quite wealthy from their trade, they were also looked down upon for dealing in human blood sport. Batiatus ran his ludus with an iron fist, determined to extract maximum profit from his human property. The ludus in Capua was a fortress-like compound, designed as much to keep the gladiators imprisoned as to train them. High walls surrounded the complex, with guards posted at every entrance. Inside were barracks where the gladiators slept in small cells, training yards where they practiced their deadly skills, and rooms where they were fitted for armor and weapons. It was a self-contained world, cut off from normal society, where death was always just one bout away. Spartacus found himself among men from every corner of the empire and beyond. Is less than #0. 5 is greater than there were Gauls from the north, with their long hair and fierce pride. There were Germans, massive and powerful, who had once roamed the forests beyond the Rhine. There were Africans, Greeks, Syrians, and men from lands whose names Spartacus had never heard. All were united by their chains and their shared fate in the arena. Among these men, Spartacus met those who would become his closest companions in the trials ahead. There was Crixus, a Gaul of noble bearing and fierce temperament, whose hatred of Rome burned like a forge fire. There was Gannicus, known for his skill with the sword and his sardonic humor even in the face of death. There was Oenomius, whose wisdom and calm demeanor made him a natural leader among the gladiators. And there was Castus, whose quiet strength would prove invaluable in the days to come. The training of a gladiator was brutal and unforgiving. Each day began before dawn, with the men roused from their cells to begin their exercises. They ran, they lifted weights, they practiced with wooden weapons for hours on end. The trainers, many of them former gladiators themselves, showed no mercy. Any sign of weakness was met with the lash, any hesitation with additional punishment. Gladiators were trained in different fighting styles, each with its own weapons and tactics. Some fought as myrmidons, with heavy armor and a short sword. Others were trained as Thracians, ironically, fighting with a curved sword called a psyche and a small square shield. There were retiari, who fought with a net and trident, and secutores, who pursued them with sword and large shield. Each style required years of practice to master. Despite the harsh conditions, Spartacus excelled in his training. His natural athleticism, combined with his earlier military experience, made him a formidable fighter. He learned quickly, absorbing the techniques taught by the trainers and adapting them to his own style. His instructors noted his intelligence, how he could analyze an opponent's weakness and exploit it with ruthless efficiency. But they also noted something else, something that would prove more dangerous than any fighting skill. Spartacus never stopped thinking like a free man. The gladiators were fed well, for they were valuable property and needed to maintain their strength. But the food was plain and monotonous, mostly barley, beans, and occasional meat. They slept on hard bunks in their cells, the doors locked each night by guards who feared the violence these trained killers could unleash. Some gladiators found comfort in the arms of slave women who served in the ludus, brief moments of tenderness in a world of brutality. It was in the ludus that Spartacus met a woman who would change his life forever. Her name, according to ancient sources, may have been Varinia, though some historians debate this. She was also from Thrace, also a slave, and when their eyes met across the compound, something passed between them, a recognition, a remembrance of home and freedom. In the darkest place imaginable, they found love. Their relationship had to be conducted in secret, in stolen moments between training sessions or whispered conversations through cell bars at night. But their connection grew stronger with each passing day, a lifeline of humanity in an inhuman place. She reminded him of the mountains of Thrace, of the life he had lost, of all the reasons why slavery was an abomination that had to be resisted. She gave him hope, and hope, as dangerous as it is precious, began to take root in Spartacus's heart. The first time Spartacus fought in the arena, he tasted the reality of his new existence. The roar of the crowd, thousands of voices crying for blood, washed over him like a physical force. The hot sand beneath his feet, the weight of his weapons, the eyes of his opponent searching for any opening, any weakness. In that moment, he understood viscerally that he was no longer a warrior fighting for honor or homeland, but a performer in a grotesque spectacle, his life worth only as much as the entertainment he could provide. But Spartacus fought, and he won. Again and again, he stepped into the arena and emerged victorious. The crowds began to know his name, to cheer when he appeared, to appreciate his skill and courage. Gladiator was pleased with his investment, seeing the gold that Spartacus could earn him. But with each victory, with each opponent he was forced to kill, something hardened inside Spartacus. His hatred for Rome, for this system that treated human beings as disposable amusements, grew like a slow-burning fire. In the quiet hours of the night, when the ludus was still and even the guards dozed at their posts, Spartacus would lie awake in his cell and think. He thought about freedom, not just for himself, but for all the men trapped in this place. He thought about the injustice of a society that could enslave millions and see nothing wrong with it. He thought about resistance, about rebellion, about what it would take to break free from these chains. He began to talk quietly with the other gladiators, testing their feelings, gauging their courage. Crixus, the proud Gaul, needed little convincing. His desire for freedom and revenge was already burning bright. Others were more cautious, afraid of the terrible punishments that awaited any slave who dared to rebel. Crucifixion, the most horrific death the Romans could devise, awaited those who challenged their masters. But Spartacus was persuasive. He spoke not with the voice of a mere gladiator, but with the authority of a leader. He painted a vision of freedom, of returning to their homelands, of living as free men once again. He acknowledged the dangers, but argued that dying in pursuit of freedom was better than living as a slave. Slowly, carefully, he built a core group of men who were willing to risk everything for a chance at liberty. The plan they devised was simple but dangerous. They would use the weapons from the ludus training rooms to overpower the guards and escape. From there, they would flee to the countryside, hoping to evade capture long enough to reach safety, wherever that might be. It was a desperate plan with little chance of success, but it was better than no plan at all. But before they could act, their conspiracy was discovered. Someone had talked, or perhaps a guard had overheard their whispered plotting. Batiatus learned of the plan and moved to crush it before it could be executed. Extra guards were posted, the weapons rooms were secured, and the conspirators were placed under closer watch. Spartacus and his companions faced a terrible choice. They could abandon their plans and accept their lot, hoping that Batiatus would show mercy for a plot that had not yet been carried out. Or they could act immediately, even though their plan had been compromised, even though the odds were now even worse than before. It was Spartacus who made the decision that would change history. On a day in 73 BCE, as the Italian sun beat down on the training yard of the ludus in Capua, he and approximately 70 other gladiators made their move. They could not access the weapons they had planned to use, so they seized whatever came to hand: kitchen knives, cooking skewers, anything that could be wielded as a weapon. The attack was sudden and ferocious. The gladiators, trained fighters who had killed before and had nothing left to lose, fell upon their guards with savage determination. The surprised guards fought back, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer fury of men who had decided that freedom or death were the only acceptable outcomes. Blood spilled on the stones of the ludus, the blood of guards, and perhaps of some gladiators who fell in the fighting. Within minutes, it was over. The rebels had seized control of the ludus. They threw open the armory and equipped themselves properly with real weapons, the gladii and spears and shields they had trained with. They freed any slaves who wished to join them, and found to their surprise that many did. Not all gladiators joined the escape. Some, perhaps fearing the consequences or having made their peace with slavery, stayed behind. But those who did flee numbered around 70 souls, 70 desperate men and women who had just declared war on the Roman Empire. As they burst through the gates of the ludus and into the streets of Capua, the townspeople scattered in terror. A group of armed gladiators was a frightening sight, and no one dared stand in their way. Spartacus led his followers out of the city at a run, knowing that pursuit would come quickly. Behind them, Capua erupted into chaos as word spread of the escape. Messengers were dispatched to Rome, guards were mustered, and the machinery of Roman retribution began to grind into motion. But Spartacus and his rebels were already disappearing into the Italian countryside, heading for the distant slopes of Mount Vesuvius. The famous volcano, which would destroy Pompeii a century and a half later, rose against the sky like a beacon. Its slopes were rough and wild, offering hiding places and defensible positions. As they ran through the fields and vineyards, past farms worked by slaves who watched them pass with wide eyes, the rebel gladiators must have felt the intoxicating rush of freedom, however temporary it might prove to be. And so the rebellion began, not with grand declarations or prepared armies, but with a desperate escape by a small band of slaves armed with kitchen knives. No one, not even Spartacus himself, could have imagined where this flight would lead, how many would join their cause, or how much fear the name Spartacus would inspire in the halls of Roman power. The gladiators' rebellion had started, and the Roman world would never be quite the same again. Night was falling as they reached the lower slopes of Vesuvius, the sky turning purple and gold above the mountain. Spartacus called a halt, and the exhausted fugitives collapsed onto the ground, breathing hard, their hearts pounding with fear and exhilaration. They had done the unthinkable. They had escaped. But as they looked at each other in the gathering darkness, they all knew the same truth. This was just the beginning. The slopes of Mount Vesuvius in the summer of 73 BCE were wild and untamed. Rough volcanic soil covered with scrub, brush, and hardy trees, the mountain rose like a natural fortress above the surrounding countryside. It was here that Spartacus and his small band of fugitive gladiators made their first camp high enough to see danger approaching from the roads below, protected by the difficult terrain that would slow any pursuers. That first night on the mountain, as they huddled around small fires, the reality of their situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. They had escaped, yes, but to what purpose? They were 70 men, however well trained, against an empire of millions. They had no supplies except what they had seized from the ludus, no food beyond what they could forage or steal, no plan except to survive one more day. It was in this moment that Spartacus truly emerged as a leader. He stood before his companions, the firelight playing across his face, and he spoke to them not of their desperate circumstances, but of their possibilities. He reminded them that they were not criminals but warriors, not cowards but the bravest men in all of Italy, for they had dared to claim their freedom. He told them that others would join them, that the countryside was full of slaves yearning to breathe free, that they could build something remarkable if they had the courage to try. The next morning proved him right. Word of the escape had spread through the slave networks that existed like invisible threads throughout the Roman world. In whispered conversations in fields and kitchens, in stables and workshops, slaves heard the incredible news. Gladiators had escaped from Capua and were defying Rome from the slopes of Vesuvius. And many decided to take the enormous risk of fleeing their own bondage to join this rebellion. They came in ones and twos at first, then in small groups. Farm slaves who slipped away in the night, household servants who seized a moment of inattention from their masters, laborers from the mines and quarries who saw in Spartacus a chance they might never have again. Men and women, young and old, from every nation that Rome had conquered, they made their way up the slopes of Vesuvius to the rebel camp. Within days, Spartacus's force had swelled from 70 to several hundred. Within weeks, it had grown to several thousand. The fugitives needed food, and they began raiding the farms and estates in the surrounding countryside. These raids were not mindless pillaging. Spartacus organized them with military precision, striking quickly and withdrawing before local forces could respond. They took food, weapons, supplies, and freed any slaves they found, offering them the choice to join or to simply flee to freedom. The raid sent shockwaves through the region. Wealthy landowners, who had never given a second thought to the slaves who worked their fields, suddenly found themselves terrified. They barricaded themselves in their villas, hired extra guards, and sent frantic messages to Rome demanding protection. The comfortable assumption that slaves were passive and broken was being shattered, and with it the sense of security that had allowed the Roman elite to sleep peacefully at night. In Rome itself, the news of the escape was initially met with dismissal and contempt. A few runaway slaves were hardly a threat to the Republic, the senators assured each other. Rome had the most powerful military in the world, legions that had conquered from Britain to Egypt. Surely a ragtag band of fugitives could be easily crushed. The Senate, occupied with what they considered more important matters of politics and empire, barely took notice of events in Campania. But the Roman authorities in Capua could not afford such complacency. They sent a force of about 3,000 local militia up Mount Vesuvius to deal with the problem. This force was led by Gaius Claudius Glaber, a praetor who saw the mission as a simple police action. He led his men up the slopes with confidence, expecting to find a frightened rabble that would scatter at the sight of organized troops. What Glaber found instead changed his perspective dramatically. The rebel camp was not the chaotic mess he expected, but an organized military position. Spartacus had chosen his ground well, positioning his forces on the heights with clear sight lines in all directions. More importantly, he had been training his new recruits, teaching them the basics of fighting in formation, instilling in them the discipline and courage they would need to face Roman soldiers. Glaber decided to lay siege to the rebel position. Rather than assault up the steep slopes where his men would be at a disadvantage, he positioned his forces to block the main paths down the mountain. He would starve them out, he thought, force them to surrender or die of hunger and thirst. It seemed like a sound strategy. After all, the rebels had nowhere to go, and time was on the side of the Romans. But Glaber had underestimated the man he was facing. Spartacus surveyed the Roman positions and recognized both the danger and the opportunity. If they stayed on the mountain, they would indeed starve. If they tried to break through the Roman lines by the main paths, they would be cut down. So Spartacus chose a third option, one so audacious that the Romans never saw it coming. On the steep side of Vesuvius, the side that Glaber had deemed too difficult to descend and therefore left unguarded, wild vines grew in abundance. Spartacus ordered his men to cut these vines and weave them into ropes and ladders. Under cover of darkness, the entire rebel force climbed down the steep cliff face using these improvised ropes, a descent that must have been terrifying, where one slip could mean a fatal fall. But they made it, every single one of them, silently reaching the base of the mountain behind the Roman lines. When dawn broke and Glaber discovered that the rebel position on the heights was empty, confusion reigned in the Roman camp. Where had the fugitives gone? Had they somehow slipped past his pickets in the night? Is less than #0. 5 is greater than. The answer came swiftly and violently when Spartacus's forces attacked the Roman camp from behind, falling upon them with ferocious determination. The battle was short and brutal. The Roman militia, caught completely by surprise and attacked from the direction they least expected, broke and ran. Glaber himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing in disgrace back to Rome. The rebels captured the Roman camp with all its supplies, weapons, and equipment. For the first time, former slaves had defeated Roman forces in open battle. The psychological impact of this victory was enormous, both for the rebels and for Rome. News of Glaber's defeat sent shockwaves through Italy. In Rome, the Senate could no longer dismiss the rebellion as a minor inconvenience. These runaway slaves had not only defied Roman authority, but had humiliated Roman military forces. The Senate's pride was stung, and more importantly, their fear was awakened. If slaves could successfully rebel, If they could defeat Roman troops, what did that mean for the stability of the entire social order? The Senate dispatched another force, this time under the command of Publius Varinius, another praetor with more military experience than Glaber. Varinius led an army of several thousand men, confident that with proper military leadership, the rebellion could be crushed. But Spartacus was not the same man who had escaped from Capua months earlier. He had tasted victory, and more importantly, he had discovered his gift for military command. Throughout the autumn and into the winter of 73 BCE, Spartacus and his growing army moved through southern Italy like a storm. They avoided direct confrontation when it suited them, using the terrain and their superior mobility to frustrate the Romans. When they did fight, they fought with a combination of gladiatorial skill, military tactics, and desperate courage that repeatedly caught the Romans off guard. Varinius pursued them doggedly, but Spartacus always seemed to be one step ahead. The rebel leader demonstrated an uncanny ability to anticipate Roman movements, to choose ground that favored his forces, and to strike where the enemy was weakest. In a series of engagements, Spartacus's forces defeated Roman units again and again, capturing their weapons and supplies each time. The rebel army continued to grow at an astounding rate. By the end of 73 BCE, Spartacus commanded not hundreds or even thousands, but tens of thousands of followers. Some estimates suggest his forces may have numbered 70,000 or more, though exact figures are difficult to determine. This was no longer a band of fugitive slaves. This was a genuine army capable of threatening Roman control of southern Italy. But with success came challenges that Spartacus could not have anticipated. His army was a diverse collection of people, united primarily by their shared status as slaves and their desire for freedom. There were gladiators and farm workers, household slaves and miners, men and women from every corner of the Roman world. They spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and had different ideas about what they were fighting for. Spartacus envisioned using their military success to fight their way north, to escape Italy entirely and return to their homelands. He dreamed of leading his Thracian followers back to Thrace, of seeing his native mountains once more as a free man. He urged his army to keep moving north, to not be distracted by plunder and revenge, but to focus on the ultimate goal of escape. But not everyone shared this vision. Crassus, the Gallic gladiator, who had been one of the original conspirators, had different ideas. He wanted to stay in Italy, to continue raiding and fighting, to extract as much revenge as possible against Rome. For Crassus, the rebellion was not just about escape, it was about vengeance for all the suffering that Rome had inflicted on conquered peoples. This disagreement created tension within the leadership of the rebellion. Spartacus and Crassus argued about strategy and objectives, and their followers began to divide along these lines. Eventually, the split became formal, with Crixus leading a force of about 30,000, primarily Gauls and Germans, to continue raiding in southern Italy, while Spartacus led the main army northward. This division would have tragic consequences, but that lay in the future. For now, in the winter of 73 to 72 BCE, Spartacus focused on preparing his army for the challenges ahead. He organized them along Roman military lines, creating units and training them in formation fighting. He appointed officers from among the most capable fighters, creating a command structure that could respond quickly to changing battlefield conditions. The army needed food, and Spartacus organized supply lines and distribution systems to ensure that his followers were fed. They needed weapons, and he set up workshops where blacksmiths, many of them freed slaves who had worked in metalcraft, forged new weapons and repaired damaged ones. The rebel camp became like a mobile city, complete with all the support structures necessary to sustain tens of thousands of people. Spartacus also had to deal with questions of justice and discipline within his ranks. Not all of his followers behaved honorably. Some committed atrocities against Romans they captured or in the towns they raided. Spartacus attempted to restrain these excesses, to maintain discipline and prevent his army from becoming a mindless mob. He instituted rules and punishments, trying to forge his diverse followers into a cohesive fighting force. In the spring of 72 BCE, Spartacus led his army northward through Italy. They moved through Campania, through Samnium, up through Picenum along the Adriatic coast. The landscape of Italy passed before them, a land of rolling hills and fertile valleys, of ancient towns and Roman roads, all of it now theirs to traverse as free people. For many in the army who had lived their entire lives in bondage, this journey was itself a kind of miracle. Rome, meanwhile, finally recognized the full magnitude of the crisis. The Senate declared the situation an emergency and appointed two consuls, Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, to lead a coordinated campaign against the rebels. Each consul commanded 2 full legions, the elite heavy infantry that formed the backbone of Roman military power. This was no longer a police action, this was war. The consul's strategy was to trap Spartacus between their 2 armies, with Gellius approaching from the south and Lentulus moving to block the rebels' northern escape route. It was a sound plan, and if it succeeded, it would end the rebellion decisively. But executing the plan required coordination and timing, and it required that Spartacus cooperate by behaving predictably. While Spartacus moved northward with the main army, Crixus and his Gallic forces remained in southern Italy, raiding through Apulia. It was there that Consul Gellius caught them near Mount Garganus. The battle was fierce and bloody, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The Gauls fought with tremendous courage, but they were facing professional Roman legions at the peak of their power. 2/3 of Crixus's army, perhaps 20,000 men and women, fell in that terrible battle. Crixus himself was killed, his dream of revenge ending in his own blood on Italian soil. When news of Crixus's death reached Spartacus, he was deeply affected. Despite their disagreements, Crixus had been one of the original conspirators, a brother in chains who had dared to dream of freedom. Spartacus decided to honor his fallen comrade in a way that was both tribute and defiance. He organized funeral games, but not games in the Roman style where slaves fought for entertainment. Instead, he forced captured Roman soldiers to fight as gladiators, giving them a taste of the degradation that slaves endured in the arena. These funeral games for Crixus sent a powerful message to Rome. The social order had been completely inverted, with Romans forced to fight for the entertainment of former slaves. It was a humiliation that struck at the very heart of Roman identity and pride. The senators in Rome were outraged, but also increasingly fearful. If Spartacus could do this, what else might he be capable of? Spartacus now faced the two consular armies that were attempting to trap him. Lesser commanders might have panicked, caught between two superior forces. But Spartacus recognized that the situation, while dangerous, also presented an opportunity. The two Roman armies were separated by distance, unable to support each other immediately. If he moved quickly, he could defeat them one at a time before they could combine their strength. He turned first on Lentulus's legions, which were blocking his path to the north. The battle occurred somewhere in northern Italy, the exact location lost to history. Spartacus's army attacked with ferocious intensity, and despite facing trained Roman legionaries, they broke through the Roman lines. Lentulus's legions were scattered, many soldiers killed or captured, the consul himself fleeing in disgrace. Before Gellius could bring his forces up to engage, Spartacus turned and marched rapidly to meet him. The second consul found himself facing an enemy who had just defeated his colleague, whose army was flush with victory and armed with captured Roman weapons. The battle was another disaster for Rome. Gellius's legions were defeated, and the consul barely escaped with his life. In the span of just a few weeks, Spartacus had defeated both consular armies, the best forces Rome could field. The path north was now open, the Alps visible on the horizon. Freedom beckoned, the chance to leave Italy and return to their homelands. Spartacus urged his army forward, toward the mountains and the liberty that lay beyond. And then, inexplicably, they stopped. With victory in their grasp, with the way to freedom clear before them, the army refused to continue north. The reasons for this decision have been debated by historians for 2,000 years. Some suggest that the army, having tasted victory and plunder, was unwilling to leave Italy and the riches it offered. Others believe that many in the army doubted they could actually survive the crossing of the Alps and the journey through hostile Gallic territory beyond. Perhaps some believed that they had Rome on the run, that they could actually defeat the empire rather than simply escape from it. Perhaps they had come to believe in their own invincibility after so many victories. Or perhaps, after so long as slaves with no control over their own destiny, they simply wanted to exercise their freedom to choose, even if that choice was ultimately self-destructive. Whatever the reasons, the decision was made to turn back, to march south through Italy once more. Spartacus, who understood the strategic situation better than anyone, must have felt a cold dread settling over him. He knew that Rome would not give up, that more armies would come, that eventually the rebellion would face forces it could not defeat. But he was the leader of free men, not a master of slaves, and he could not force them to do what they did not wish to do. The army marched south through the summer of 72 BCE, moving through the heart of Italy like a conquering force. They raided, they recruited more followers, and they continued to defeat any Roman forces that tried to stop them. At Mutina in northern Italy, they defeated another Roman army under the praetor Gaius Cassius Longinus. At every turn, they demonstrated that they were a military force to be reckoned with. But in Rome, the mood had shifted from outrage to genuine fear. The Senate held emergency sessions to discuss the crisis. Spartacus's army was now estimated at over 100,000 strong, and they were moving freely through Italy, apparently unstoppable. The very foundation of Roman society, the institution of slavery, was being challenged in the most dramatic way possible. If this rebellion succeeded, if slaves realized they could fight and win, what would prevent similar uprisings throughout the empire? The Senate needed someone who could end this crisis decisively. They turned to Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest men in Rome and a competent military commander. Crassus was given extraordinary powers and command of 8 legions, more than 40,000 men, with authorization to recruit more if needed. He was also given a clear message from the Senate. Failure was not an option. As summer turned to autumn in 72 BCE, the rebel army continued its march south, moving through Lucania toward the coast. Some sources suggest that Spartacus was attempting to negotiate passage with Cilician pirates to transport his army across the sea to Sicily. Sicily had been the site of major slave rebellions in the past, and perhaps Spartacus hoped to link up with potential allies there, or simply to find a place where they might establish themselves beyond Rome's immediate reach. The negotiations with the pirates, if they occurred, came to nothing. Whether the pirates were bribed by Rome to refuse passage, or simply decided it was too risky to help the rebels, the result was the same. The army was trapped in southern Italy with winter approaching and a massive Roman force under Crassus bearing down on them. The sun set slowly over the Italian landscape as Spartacus and his followers made camp in Lucania. The air grew cooler with the approach of evening, and campfires began to dot the hillsides where the rebel army was spread. Spartacus stood apart from the crowds, looking north toward Rome, toward the empire that had enslaved him and millions of others. He had led his people farther than anyone could have imagined, had won victories that would be remembered for millennia. But he could feel it in his bones. The greatest test was yet to come. The winter of 72 to 71 BCE descended upon southern Italy with unusual severity. Cold winds swept down from the mountains, and rain fell in sheets, turning roads to mud and swelling rivers beyond their banks. For Spartacus and his vast army of former slaves, this would be the harshest season yet, not just because of the weather, but because they now faced an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. Marcus Licinius Crassus was a different breed of Roman commander from those who had previously pursued the rebels. He was one of the richest men in the world, having made his fortune through property speculation and the silver mines of Spain. But Crassus wanted more than wealth. He craved military glory and political power to match that of his rivals, Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar. The war against Spartacus was his opportunity to achieve both. Crassus understood that previous Roman commanders had failed because they had underestimated their enemy and lacked discipline in their own ranks. He was determined not to make the same mistakes. When he took command of the Roman forces, he immediately set about restoring military discipline with brutal efficiency. The first test came when one of his legions broke and fled before the rebels in a minor engagement. Crassus's response was shocking even by Roman standards. He revived the ancient and terrible punishment of decimation. The entire legion was lined up, and every 10th man, chosen by lot, was beaten to death by his fellow soldiers. 500 men died, not at the hands of the enemy, but as punishment for cowardice. This brutal act sent a clear message to the Roman forces. Crassus was more to be feared than the enemy. Running from battle was not an option. Death lay in both directions, but at least in battle there was a chance of survival and glory. The Roman legions under Crassus became grimly determined, knowing that their commander would accept nothing less than total commitment. Crassus did not immediately rush to engage Spartacus in battle. Instead, he adopted a strategy of harassment and containment. He shadowed the rebel army, preventing them from settling in any one place for long, cutting off their foraging parties and gradually wearing them down. It was a war of attrition, and Crassus had the resources of the Roman state behind him, while Spartacus had only what his army could carry or steal. The rebel army, now somewhere between 70 and 120,000 strong according to various ancient sources, was becoming harder to sustain with each passing week. That many people required enormous amounts of food and water, and the Italian countryside, picked over by months of war and raiding, was becoming exhausted. The army included not just fighters, but also camp followers, families, the elderly and young, all of whom needed to be fed and protected. Spartacus attempted several times to break out of southern Italy and move north again, but Crassus blocked him at every turn. The Roman commander had deployed his 8 legions strategically, creating a net that tightened slowly but inexorably around the rebels. Every time Spartacus tried to slip through, he found Roman forces waiting. As winter deepened, Spartacus made a fateful decision. He would lead his army to the very southern tip of Italy, to the region of Bruttium, to the shores of the narrow strait that separated Italy from Sicily. Perhaps he still hoped to find passage to Sicily, or perhaps he simply needed to put some distance between his army and Crassus's pursuing legions. Whatever his reasoning, the army marched south through the cold and rain. When they reached Bruttium, Spartacus found himself trapped on a peninsula with limited resources and no easy escape. Crassus, seeing his opportunity, decided to build a wall across the entire neck of the peninsula, from the Tyrrhenian Sea on one side to the Ionian Sea on the other. It was an audacious engineering project, a fortification stretching nearly 40 miles across rugged terrain. Thousands of Roman soldiers labored through the winter to build this wall. They dug a deep trench, 15 feet wide and 15 feet deep, according to Plutarch's account. Behind the trench, they erected a wooden palisade wall topped with sharpened stakes. Watchtowers were built at regular intervals, manned day and night by Roman sentries. It was a massive undertaking, but Crassus drove his men relentlessly, determined to seal Spartacus and his followers in their peninsular prison. For weeks, the rebels found themselves penned in Bruttium, while Crassus's wall grew longer and stronger each day is less than #0. 5 is greater than food became scarce, then scarcer still. The army foraged across the peninsula, stripping it bare of anything edible. Tensions rose within the camp as hunger gnawed at discipline and unity. Some began to despair, wondering if their brief taste of freedom would end in starvation behind Roman walls. But Spartacus had not survived this long by accepting defeat. He studied Crassus's wall, looking for weaknesses, waiting for opportunity. That opportunity came on a winter night when a fierce storm rolled in from the sea. Wind howled, rain fell in torrents, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. The Roman sentries huddled in their towers, trying to stay dry, their vigilance dulled by the miserable conditions. On that wild night, Spartacus ordered a section of the trench filled in with earth, stones, and timber. anything that could be thrown into it. Working frantically in the darkness and storm, thousands of rebels labored to create a causeway across the trench. When enough of the trench was filled, the army charged across, overwhelming the surprised Roman guards in that section of the wall. By dawn, a third of Spartacus's army had escaped the trap, breaking out into the wider reaches of southern Italy once more. It was a stunning achievement, demonstrating once again Spartacus's ability to find solutions when all seemed lost. But the breakout also revealed the growing divisions within the rebel ranks. Not all of the army escaped that night. Whether by choice or circumstance, a large portion remained behind in Bruttium. Some sources suggest that a group of followers, perhaps as many as 30,000, split off under different leaders, choosing to stay and fight in southern Italy rather than follow Spartacus north. The unity of purpose that had sustained the rebellion was fracturing under the pressure of the Roman campaign. Crassus was furious at the escape, but quickly regrouped. He sent forces to deal with those rebels still trapped in Bruttium, while he personally led 6 legions in pursuit of Spartacus's main force. The hunt was on once more, and this time Crassus was determined not to let his prey escape. But now Crassus faced a new complication. The Senate, alarmed by the continuation of the war and eager to see it ended, had summoned additional forces. Pompey the Great was recalled from Spain with his legions. Marcus Licinius was ordered to bring his forces from Macedonia. Both commanders were instructed to march to Italy and help crush the rebellion. For Crassus, this was both help and threat. More Roman forces meant a better chance of victory, but it also meant that the glory of defeating Spartacus might be shared with, or even stolen by, his rivals. Pompey in particular was known for arriving at the end of campaigns and claiming credit for victories won by others. Crassus needed to defeat Spartacus quickly before Pompey arrived. Spartacus, meanwhile, was moving north through Lucania, trying to stay ahead of Crassus while also foraging for food and maintaining order in his army. The constant marching, the lack of sufficient provisions, and the relentless Roman pursuit were taking their toll. Men were deserting, some choosing to flee into the countryside to take their chances alone rather than remain with the increasingly desperate army. In early 71 BCE, disaster struck the rebel cause. A force of rebels under the command of 2 leaders, Castus and Gannicus, separated from the main army, possibly hoping to move independently and forage more effectively. Crassus saw this as an opportunity to divide and conquer. He sent his legate, Lucius Quinctius, with a force to engage this separated group. The battle that followed was fierce and bloody. The rebels fought with desperate courage, knowing that defeat meant death or a return to slavery worse than death. But they were facing professional Roman legionaries who had been drilled relentlessly by Crassus. and who feared their commander as much as they feared the enemy. The Roman formations held firm, their short swords working with mechanical efficiency, cutting down the rebels in their hundreds. Castus and Gannicus, those gladiators who had been part of the original escape from Capua, fell in that battle along with perhaps 12,000 of their followers. It was a devastating blow to the rebellion, both in numbers and in morale. Two of Spartacus's most trusted lieutenants were dead, and a significant portion of his army was destroyed. News of this defeat reached Spartacus as he continued his march north. He knew that time was running out, that the noose was tightening around him and his remaining followers. Reports came that Pompey was approaching from the north with his legions. Lucullus's forces were landing on the coast. The strategic situation was becoming impossible. It was at this point that Spartacus made what would be his final strategic decision. He could no longer run, no longer evade. The only path left was to turn and face Crassus in open battle, to stake everything on one final confrontation. Perhaps if he could defeat or even just severely damage Crassus's legions, he might buy enough time and space to negotiate a retreat from Italy. Or perhaps he simply recognized that running was no longer an option, and that if his rebellion was to end, it would end on the battlefield with honor rather than in a gradual dissolution of desertion and starvation. Spartacus prepared his army for the coming battle. He made speeches to rally his followers, reminding them of how far they had come, of the freedom they had tasted, of the dignity they had reclaimed. He told them that it was better to die as free men in battle than to live one more day as slaves. His words stirred their hearts, and the army prepared to make its final stand. According to Plutarch, Spartacus performed a symbolic act before the battle that demonstrated his commitment and his understanding of what was to come. His followers brought him his horse, a magnificent animal befitting a successful commander. But Spartacus drew his sword and killed the horse, saying that if he won the battle, he would have plenty of horses to choose from among the Roman cavalry. And if he lost, he would have no need of a horse at all. It was a dramatic gesture, meant to show his men that he would not flee, that he would stand with them to the end. A commander on horseback could escape from a lost battle. A commander on foot would share the fate of his army. In killing his horse, Spartacus was committing himself absolutely to the coming battle, for better or worse. The location of the final battle is uncertain, somewhere in southern Italy, probably in Lucania or the border region with Bruttium. The exact details have been lost to time, and ancient sources differ in their accounts. But what is clear is that in the spring of 71 BCE, Spartacus and his army faced Crassus and the assembled might of Rome in a battle that would decide the fate of the rebellion once and for all. The night before the battle, campfires burned across the opposing camps. In the Roman camp, soldiers checked their equipment and offered prayers to Mars, the god of war. They were professional soldiers, confident in their training and discipline, eager to end this long campaign and return home with honor and plunder. In the rebel camp, the mood was more somber, but no less determined. These were men and women who had lived as slaves, who had known degradation and suffering, who had tasted freedom and would not give it up without a fight. They sharpened their weapons, embraced their loved ones, and prepared their hearts for what tomorrow would bring. Spartacus moved among his troops that night, speaking words of encouragement, clasping hands, meeting eyes. He visited the Thracians who reminded him of home, the Gauls who had followed Crassus and now followed him, the Germans and Greeks and Syrians and Africans who had all come together under his leadership. He saw the faces of those who had joined him at Vesuvius, who had marched with him the length of Italy, who had shared in victories and defeats. As dawn approached, washing the sky with pale light, both armies began to form up for battle. The Roman legions assembled in their perfect formations, each man in his place, shields locked, javelins at the ready. The rebels formed their own lines, less perfect perhaps, but no less determined. Their weapons a mixture of captured Roman arms and improvised weapons, their armor whatever they had been able to scavenge or make. The last stars faded from the sky as the sun climbed above the horizon, illuminating the field where thousands of men would soon fight and die. The air was still, filled with that peculiar tension that precedes battle, when every heartbeat sounds loud and time seems to slow. Officers shouted final orders, standards were raised, and the two armies faced each other across the trampled ground. The morning sun climbed higher in the Italian sky, casting long shadows across the battlefield. Two armies stood facing each other, representing not just military forces but two fundamentally opposed visions of the world. On one side stood the legions of Rome, the most powerful military machine the ancient world had ever seen, representing order, civilization, and the conviction that some men were born to rule while others were born to serve. On the other side stood the rebel army of Spartacus, representing the revolutionary idea that all people deserved freedom, that no one should be property, that human dignity belonged to everyone regardless of birth or circumstance. The armies were not evenly matched, at least not on paper. Crassus commanded approximately 40,000 well-trained, well-equipped Roman legionaries, men who had spent years mastering the art of formation warfare. They wore standardized armor and carried the gladius, the short sword that had conquered most of the known world. They fought with discipline and coordination that came from rigorous training and harsh punishment for any failure. Spartacus's army was larger in raw numbers, perhaps 50,000 or more, but it was far more diverse in training and equipment. Some were former gladiators, superbly skilled fighters but trained for single combat rather than formation warfare. Others were former farm slaves who had learned to fight only during the rebellion itself. Their weapons and armor were a hodgepodge of captured Roman equipment, improvised weapons, and whatever else they could obtain. But what Spartacus's army lacked in uniformity, it made up for in motivation. These were people fighting for their very existence, for freedom, for the right to live as human beings rather than property. They knew that defeat would mean death, or a return to slavery, likely in the mines where life expectancy was measured in months. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain. As the two armies completed their formations, Spartacus gave his final orders to his commanders. His strategy was bold and direct, to break through the Roman center and reach Crassus himself. If Spartacus could kill the Roman commander, it might throw the legions into confusion and give the rebels a chance at victory. It was a desperate plan, but Spartacus was out of options and out of time. The battle began with the Roman legions launching their javelins, the pila that were designed to pierce shields and armor. Thousands of these heavy spears arced through the air, a deadly rain that fell upon the rebel front ranks. Men cried out as the iron points found their marks, shields splintered, and the first blood of the day stained the earth. Then came the moment of contact, when the two lines crashed together with a sound like thunder. Shields slammed against shields, swords thrust and stabbed, and the grim work of battle began. The Romans fought with mechanical precision, each legionary protecting the man beside him, their short swords darting forward from behind their large shields to find gaps in the enemy's defense. The rebels fought with ferocious courage, knowing this was their last chance. Former gladiators used their arena skills, looking for openings, striking with precision at vulnerable points. Others simply pressed forward with raw determination, accepting wounds to deliver their own strikes. The battle line became a grinding, bloody meat grinder, where men pushed and stabbed and died in the crush of bodies. Spartacus himself fought in the front ranks, a rare thing for a commander, but entirely in keeping with his character. He had killed his horse to ensure he could not flee, and now he fought his way forward, trying to reach Crassus. Around him, his most loyal followers fought to protect their leader and clear a path through the Roman ranks. The ancient sources, particularly Plutarch and Appian, tell us that Spartacus fought with extraordinary valor and skill. He killed 2 centurions in personal combat, those officers who were the backbone of Roman military discipline. He pressed forward, slashing and stabbing, his blade red with Roman blood, his eyes fixed on the spot where he knew Crassus must be. But Crassus was well protected, surrounded by his best troops, and the distance was too great. As Spartacus fought his way through the Roman lines, the legions began to show their superior training and organization. The Roman formations held together even under tremendous pressure, while the rebel formations began to fragment and lose cohesion. The Roman cavalry, which had been positioned on the flanks, now swept around to attack the rebels from the sides and rear. This was the standard Roman tactic, and it was devastatingly effective. The rebels found themselves pressed from multiple directions, their lines buckling under the assault. Spartacus, seeing his forces beginning to break, redoubled his efforts to reach Crassus. If he could not win the battle, perhaps he could at least kill the Roman commander and make his death mean something. He pushed forward with a small group of his most devoted followers, cutting through the Roman ranks like a spearhead. But he was wounded. An arrow or javelin, the sources are unclear, struck him in the leg. The pain must have been excruciating, but Spartacus fought on, unable or unwilling to fall, while Romans still stood before him. He dropped to one knee, holding his shield before him, his sword still striking at any Roman who came within reach. His companions tried to protect him, forming a ring around their wounded leader, but the Roman numbers were overwhelming. One by one, Spartacus's defenders fell until he stood alone, wounded and surrounded by enemies. The ex-slave who had shaken an empire, who had defeated consul after consul, who had led the greatest slave rebellion in history, made his final stand on a blood-soaked field in southern Italy. The Roman soldiers closed in, wary even now of the wounded gladiator's skill. Spartacus fought to the very end, his sword rising and falling until his strength finally failed him. He died as he had lived in these final years, as a free man fighting for freedom, refusing to surrender or submit. The ancient sources tell us that Spartacus's body was never recovered or identified with certainty after the battle. In the chaos and carnage of that terrible day, surrounded by thousands of dead and dying, he simply disappeared into history. Some suggest that his body was so hacked and trampled that it could not be recognized. Others speculate that his followers may have managed to carry it away for burial in some unknown place. With Spartacus fallen, the heart went out of the rebel army. They had followed him because they believed in him, because his courage gave them courage, because his leadership gave them hope. Now that he was gone, that hope died with him. The rebel formations disintegrated, and what had been a battle became a slaughter. The Roman legions pursued the fleeing rebels across the countryside, cutting them down without mercy. Thousands died in the rout, trampled under the hooves of Roman cavalry, or killed by the systematic advance of the legion formations. Some rebels tried to surrender, throwing down their weapons and begging for their lives, but Crassus had given orders that no quarter be given. By the time the sun set on that terrible day, the field was covered with bodies. Ancient sources suggest that as many as 60,000 rebels died in the battle and the pursuit that followed. The magnitude of the slaughter was staggering even by the brutal standards of ancient warfare. About 6,000 rebels were captured alive, taken as prisoners by the victorious Romans. For these unfortunate souls, death on the battlefield would have been a mercy compared to what awaited them. Crassus, determined to send a message that would resonate throughout the Roman world, ordered a punishment of unprecedented scale and cruelty. The 6,000 prisoners were to be crucified along the Appian Way, the great road that ran from Rome to Capua, where the rebellion had begun. For 130 miles, at intervals of about 40 yards, crosses were erected and prisoners nailed to them. Crucifixion was the most horrific death the Romans could devise, reserved for slaves and the worst criminals. The condemned were nailed or tied to wooden crosses and left to die slowly, sometimes taking days, of exhaustion, exposure, and asphyxiation as their body weight made breathing increasingly difficult. It was designed not just to kill but to humiliate, to display the victim's powerlessness and suffering as a warning to others. The sight along the Appian Way must have been beyond nightmarish. For days, anyone traveling between Rome and Capua would pass cross after cross, each bearing a dying or dead rebel. The sounds of suffering, the smell of death, the visual horror of thousands of crucified men lining the road for miles and miles, it was calculated to terrorize and to demonstrate the absolute power of Rome over those who dared to rebel. Crassus returned to Rome in triumph, though his glory was somewhat diminished by the arrival of Pompey. Pompey had encountered 5,000 rebels who had escaped from the main battle and were fleeing north. He destroyed this group and then sent a letter to the Senate claiming that while Crassus had defeated the slaves in battle, he, Pompey, had ended the war by destroying its roots. It was a typical piece of Pompey's self-promotion, and it infuriated Crassus, but there was nothing he could do about it. The Senate voted Crassus an ovation, a lesser form of triumph, while they reserved the full triumph for Pompey for his victories in Spain. Crassus had won the war against Spartacus, but in the competitive world of Roman politics, he still came in second to his rival. This humiliation would fester in Crassus's mind for years, eventually leading him to his own death seeking military glory in Parthia. For Rome, the war against Spartacus had been terrifying but ultimately reaffirming. The social order had been challenged and then violently restored. The slaves had risen, but they had been crushed, and the punishment meted out to them served as a stark warning to any who might think of following their example. The crucified bodies along the Appian Way remained for years, bones picked clean by birds, a permanent memorial to the cost of rebellion. Yet, even in defeat, even in the horror of those crosses lining the road, Spartacus and his followers had accomplished something remarkable. They had shown that slaves were not passive property, but human beings capable of organized resistance. They had defeated Roman armies again and again, had ranged freely through Italy for 2 years, had built an army that at its peak numbered over 100,000 strong. They had made Rome fear. The question of what happened to Spartacus's companion, that Thracian woman who some sources call Verinia, is lost to history. Did she die in the final battle? Was she captured and crucified along the Appian Way? Did she escape to live out her days in hiding, carrying the memory of the man she had loved and the dream of freedom they had shared? We will never know. Her fate, like the fates of so many in that rebellion, disappeared into the silence that history reserves for the powerless. In the immediate aftermath of the rebellion, Rome took steps to ensure that such an uprising could never happen again. Security at gladiatorial schools was increased dramatically. The number of slaves allowed to congregate in any one place was restricted. Harsh new penalties were established for any slave who raised a hand against a citizen. The Roman elite, badly frightened by how close the rebellion had come to threatening their way of life, were determined to tighten their control. But no amount of precaution could erase what had happened. The memory of Spartacus lived on, whispered about in slave quarters, spoken of with a mixture of fear and admiration by Romans themselves. He became a legend almost immediately, a symbol of resistance against oppression, a reminder that even the most powerful empire could be challenged by those it sought to enslave. The ancient historians who wrote about Spartacus, though they were Romans writing for Roman audiences, could not help but express a certain grudging respect for him. Plutarch called him a man of great spirit and strength, and noted his intelligence and gentleness, unusual qualities for a slave rebel in Roman eyes. Even these writers, products of a slave-holding society, seemed to recognize that there was something exceptional about Spartacus, something that transcended the simple categories of slave and master, civilized and barbarian. As the years passed and became decades, and decades became centuries, the story of Spartacus was told and retold. Details were lost, embellished, transformed by the passage of time and the agendas of those telling the story. But the core remained, a slave who refused to accept his slavery, who fought for freedom against impossible odds, who led the greatest rebellion the Roman world had ever seen. The crosses along the Appian Way eventually fell to dust, and new generations of Romans traveled that road without thinking of the horrors that had once lined it. But the story persisted, passed down through the centuries in histories and legends, in whispered tales among the oppressed, and in cautionary stories told by the powerful. In the darkness of that long-ago Italian night, after the final battle, after the slaughter had ended and the survivors had been rounded up for their terrible fate, somewhere on that blood-soaked field lay the body of Spartacus. The Thracian who had dared to dream of freedom, who had transformed from gladiator to general, who had led an army of the dispossessed against the mightiest empire on earth, had fallen. But his spirit, the idea he represented, the hope he had kindled in the hearts of the enslaved that could not be killed by Roman swords or crucified along Roman roads, that would live on, carried forward through the ages by all those who yearned for liberty and dignity, who refused to accept that some people were born to be property and others born to be masters. The moon rose over Italy that night, casting its silver light on fields where so many had died, fighting for a simple revolutionary idea that all people deserve to be free. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the human dramas played out below, but bearing silent witness to courage and sacrifice, to the eternal struggle between tyranny and liberty. And in that moonlight, if you had listened carefully, you might have heard the echo of Spartacus's voice, calling to all who would listen, better to die as free men than to live as slaves. It was a message that would resound through history, inspiring rebels and revolutionaries for millennia to come. 2,000 years have passed since Spartacus led his rebellion against Rome, 2 millennia of human history marked by countless wars and revolutions, by the rise and fall of empires, by the slow, painful struggle of humanity toward justice and equality. And yet his story endures, told and retold, adapted and reinterpreted, but always carrying that essential message about freedom and human dignity. In the centuries immediately following the rebellion, Spartacus remained a controversial figure in the Roman imagination. He was the slave who had nearly brought Rome to its knees, a reminder of the Republic's vulnerability and the potential dangers lurking in the institution that underpinned all of Roman society. Romans spoke his name with a mixture of fear and respect, never quite able to dismiss him as a mere bandit or criminal. The gladiatorial games continued in Rome for centuries after Spartacus, growing ever more elaborate and bloody. The Colosseum, built decades after the rebellion, would see thousands upon thousands of gladiators fight and die for the entertainment of the masses. But security at the gladiatorial schools remained tight, and never again would there be an escape and rebellion on the scale of what Spartacus had led. Slavery itself would persist in the Roman world for centuries more, gradually evolving and eventually fading as the empire declined and Christianity spread. But Spartacus had planted a seed, the idea that slavery was not an immutable fact of nature, but a human institution that could be challenged and resisted. That seed would lie dormant for many years, but it would eventually grow. With the fall of Rome and the coming of the Middle Ages, the story of Spartacus nearly disappeared from popular consciousness. The ancient texts that preserved his story, works by Plutarch, Appian, and others, were maintained in monasteries and libraries, read by scholars but unknown to the general population. For nearly 1,000 years, Spartacus was remembered only by those who studied ancient history. But with the Renaissance came a revival of interest in classical antiquity, and educated Europeans rediscovered the tale of the gladiator who had defied Rome. Spartacus began to appear in plays and historical works, his story interpreted through the lens of Renaissance humanism, with its emphasis on individual dignity and the worth of all people. The Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century brought new interest in Spartacus as thinkers began to question traditional hierarchies and argue for natural rights and equality. Philosophers like Voltaire referenced Spartacus as an example of justified resistance against tyranny. As revolutionary ideas spread across Europe and America, Spartacus became a symbol of the struggle against oppression. The French Revolution saw revolutionaries explicitly invoke Spartacus's name and example. The Jacobins, the radical faction that came to dominate the revolution, particularly admired Spartacus as someone who had fought against an oppressive social order. For a brief time, there was even a Spartacus League in revolutionary France, though it was short-lived. In the Americas, where the question of slavery was tearing nations apart, Spartacus's story took on new resonance. Abolitionists pointed to him as proof that the enslaved would always resist their bondage, that the desire for freedom was universal and could not be permanently suppressed. For the enslaved themselves, though many could not read the ancient texts, the story of Spartacus was passed along as oral tradition, adapted and transformed, but always carrying that message of resistance and hope. The Haitian Revolution of 1791, when enslaved Africans overthrew their French masters and established the first black republic in the Americas, was in some ways a fulfillment of what Spartacus had attempted. Toussaint Louverture, the brilliant leader of the Haitian Revolution, was sometimes called the Black Spartacus, a comparison that honored both men and linked their struggles across the centuries. The 19th century saw Spartacus become a figure in literature and art. Romantic poets and painters, drawn to tales of heroic resistance against tyranny, found in Spartacus an ideal subject. His story was retold in poems, paintings, and operas, each interpretation reflecting the concerns and ideologies of its creator while maintaining the core narrative of the slave rebellion. The rise of socialist and communist movements in the 19th and 20th centuries brought renewed interest in Spartacus as a symbol of class struggle. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote admiringly of Spartacus, seeing him as a precursor to the workers' revolutions they advocated. In 1916, during World War I, German socialists Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg founded the Spartacus League, which would play a crucial role in the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919. The 20th century saw Spartacus's story reach the widest audience it had ever known, through the power of cinema. In 1960, director Stanley Kubrick released Spartacus, starring Kirk Douglas in the title role. The film, though taking many liberties with history, brought the story to millions of people around the world and cemented Spartacus's place in popular culture. That film's most famous scene, where Roman soldiers demand that captured rebels identify Spartacus, and each man in turn declares, "I am Spartacus," became an iconic moment in cinema history. Though entirely fictional, this scene captured something essential about Spartacus's legacy: the idea that his cause was larger than any individual, that the fight for freedom and dignity belonged to all people. The film was made during the height of the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement in America, and it resonated with audiences who saw parallels between Spartacus's struggle and their own fights against oppression. The screenwriter, Dalton Trumbo, had been blacklisted during the McCarthy era for his political beliefs, and his personal experience with persecution gave the film an added dimension of authenticity and passion. In the decades since, Spartacus has remained a potent symbol, invoked by protest movements and freedom fighters around the world. When people stand up against dictatorships, when workers strike for better conditions, when the oppressed demand their rights, the spirit of Spartacus is there, reminding them that resistance is possible, that even the mightiest empire can be challenged. Historians continue to study the rebellion, using archaeological evidence and careful analysis of ancient texts to piece together what actually happened. Modern scholarship has helped us understand the social and economic context of Roman slavery, the military tactics of both sides, and the reasons why the rebellion ultimately failed. Yet, even as we gain more historical knowledge, the legend of Spartacus retains its power. What is it about this story that continues to captivate us after all these centuries? Perhaps it is the universal appeal of the underdog, the small force challenging overwhelming odds. Perhaps it is the fundamental justice of the cause, the simple truth that no person should be owned by another. Perhaps it is admiration for Spartacus himself, this slave who became a general, this gladiator who became a liberator. But more than anything, the story endures because it speaks to something deep in the human spirit, the yearning for freedom that exists in every person, regardless of when or where they live. Spartacus reminds us that this yearning is so powerful that people will risk everything, will face certain death, rather than live without dignity and liberty. The rebellion failed in its immediate objectives. Spartacus and his followers did not escape to freedom, did not overthrow Roman slavery, did not live happily ever after in their homelands. They died, almost all of them, in battle or on crosses along the Appian Way. By any practical measure, the rebellion was a complete failure. Yet in another sense, in perhaps the most important sense, Spartacus won a victory that has echoed through the millennia. He proved that slaves were not passive property but human beings with courage, intelligence, and the capacity to organize and fight. He demonstrated that no system of oppression is so complete that it cannot be challenged. He showed that the desire for freedom is stronger than the fear of death. Every slave rebellion that followed, from the Haitian Revolution to the American Civil War, owed something to Spartacus. Every movement for human rights and dignity, every struggle against tyranny and injustice, carries forward the flame that he lit on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. His specific rebellion may have been crushed, but the idea it represented could not be killed. In our own time, when we see people standing up against oppression, whether in Tahrir Square or Tiananmen Square, in Selma or Soweto, we see the spirit of Spartacus. When workers organize for fair treatment, when refugees flee tyranny seeking freedom, when anyone anywhere says, "I will not be treated as less than human," they are continuing the struggle that Spartacus began. The story also serves as a reminder of the terrible costs of oppression and the violence it breeds. Spartacus did not begin his life wanting to lead a rebellion. He was forced into slavery, forced to fight as a gladiator, forced into a position where rebellion was the only alternative to a slow death in bondage. The violence of his rebellion was a response to the violence of slavery itself. Rome's brutal suppression of the rebellion, the 6,000 crosses along the Appian Way, demonstrated the lengths to which oppressors will go to maintain their power. But it also showed the ultimate futility of such violence. You can kill rebels, but you cannot kill the idea of rebellion. You can crucify thousands, but you cannot crucify hope. As we think about Spartacus today, we might wonder what he would make of the world we have built. Legal slavery has been abolished in most of the world, though it still exists in hidden forms and in some places continues openly. The gladiatorial games are gone, replaced by sports that do not typically end in death, though violence remains entertainment for many. Yet inequality and oppression persist in new forms. Billions of people around the world live in poverty, while others enjoy unimaginable wealth. Workers are exploited, their labor undervalued, their dignity ignored. Refugees flee war and persecution, seeking safety and finding walls and closed borders. The specific form of oppression may have changed, but the fundamental struggle continues. Spartacus teaches us that this struggle is never finished, that each generation must fight its own battles for justice and freedom. He also teaches us that even when the immediate battle is lost, the example of courage and resistance inspires others. His rebellion lasted only 2 years, but its impact has lasted 2 millennia and counting. There is also a personal lesson in the story of Spartacus, one that speaks to each of us as individuals rather than as members of social movements or political causes. Spartacus reminds us that we have choices, even in the most difficult circumstances. He could have accepted his lot as a gladiator, could have survived by simply doing what he was told, could have lived a life of comfortable slavery if he had been willing to give up his freedom of spirit. Instead, he chose to resist, knowing that resistance would likely lead to his death. He chose to fight for something larger than himself, to lead others toward freedom even when that freedom remained just out of reach. He chose in the end to die as a free man rather than live as a slave. That choice, made so long ago on a battlefield in Italy, continues to inspire us today. As you drift toward sleep tonight, perhaps you might imagine that night before the final battle, when Spartacus moved among his followers, offering words of encouragement and hope. Perhaps you might imagine the courage it took for those rebels to face the Roman legions, knowing that defeat was likely but believing that the fight itself was worth the cost. Or perhaps you might imagine a quieter moment earlier in the story, when Spartacus and his companions sat together on the slopes of Vesuvius, looking at the stars and talking about freedom, about home, about the possibility of a better world. In that moment, they were not just a gladiator and a slave, but two human beings daring to dream, to hope, to love, despite everything that sought to crush their humanity. The stars they looked at that night are the same stars we see tonight, the same constellations wheeling overhead, connecting us across the vast gulf of time to those who came before. Under those stars, Spartacus and his followers dared to challenge an empire, to say that human dignity and freedom matter more than safety or comfort, that some things are worth fighting for even when victory is impossible. As the night deepens and sleep approaches, let the story of Spartacus settle gently into your thoughts. Let it remind you that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that the powerless can challenge the powerful, that hope persists even in the darkest times. Let it remind you that we are all connected to this long human story of the struggle for freedom and dignity. 2,000 years ago, a slave who became a gladiator decided that he would rather die free than live in chains. He led a rebellion that shook Rome to its foundations and inspired millions across the centuries. His body fell on a battlefield and was lost to history, but his spirit lives on in every heart that yearns for freedom, in every person who stands up against injustice, in every soul that refuses to be diminished by the circumstances of their birth. The story of Spartacus reminds us that we are not just isolated individuals living our separate lives, but part of a great continuous story of humanity's struggle toward light, toward justice, toward a world where every person is recognized as having inherent dignity and worth. Each of us, in our own way, can be part of that story, can carry forward the torch that Spartacus lit so long ago. Sleep now and dream of freedom, Dream of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Dream of ordinary people doing extraordinary things because they believed in something larger than themselves. Dream of Spartacus, the slave who became a legend, whose name still echoes through history as a reminder that the human spirit cannot be permanently enslaved, that the desire for freedom is as eternal as the stars themselves. And when you wake, perhaps you will carry with you something of that courage, that determination, that refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. Perhaps you will remember that you too have choices, that you too can make a difference, that the spirit of Spartacus lives on in all of us who believe that a better world is possible and worth fighting for. The night is quiet now, peaceful and still. Somewhere in Italy, the ruins of ancient Rome sleep under the same moon that shone on Spartacus and his followers. The Appian Way, where those 6,000 crosses once stood, is now a road for tourists and pilgrims, the bones of the crucified long since returned to dust. But the story endures, passed down through the generations, transformed and retold, but always carrying that essential truth about freedom and human dignity. Close your eyes now and let yourself drift on the gentle currents of sleep. Let the story of Spartacus accompany you into dreams, a reminder that even in the darkest times, even when all seems lost, the human capacity for courage and resistance remains. Let it be a comfort and an inspiration, a bridge connecting you to all those throughout history who have fought for freedom, who have refused to accept the world as it is, and have worked to make it what it should be. The gladiators' rebellion is over, ended 2,000 years ago on a battlefield whose exact location we cannot even name. But the struggle Spartacus represents continues, and will continue as long as there is injustice in the world, as long as some are oppressed while others are free, as long as there are people who believe that all human beings deserve dignity and liberty. Rest now and let the story settle into your heart. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges and opportunities, its own small chances to stand up for what is right, to resist what is wrong, to carry forward in your own way the legacy of all those who have fought for freedom before you. But tonight is for rest, for peaceful dreams, for the quiet knowledge that you are connected to something larger than yourself, part of the great human story that began long before you were born and will continue long after you are gone. You are connected to Spartacus and to all who have fought for freedom, connected by the common bonds of humanity, by the universal desire for dignity and justice. Sleep well, traveler through time. Sleep peacefully, knowing that the story endures, that the struggle continues, that hope persists. Sleep deeply and dream of freedom, of courage, of a world where every person is valued and free. Sleep gently and let let the spirit of Spartacus watch over you, reminding you that even the smallest act of resistance matters, that even the quietest voice speaking truth can echo through eternity. And so ends our story, though the story itself never truly ends. Spartacus lives on, in history books and films, in legends and dreams, but most importantly in the hearts of all who refuse to give up hope, who refuse to accept oppression, who believe that freedom is worth fighting for. His rebellion failed, but his legacy endures, an eternal flame passed from generation to generation, lighting the way toward a better world. Good night, and may you dream of gladiators who became generals, of slaves who became liberators, of ordinary people who did extraordinary things because they believed in freedom. May the story of Spartacus comfort and inspire you, tonight and always. The stars shine down, as they have for millions of years, as they will for millions more. Under those stars, Spartacus fought and died. Under those stars, his followers dreamed of freedom. And under those same stars, we too dream our dreams and live our lives, connected across time by the eternal human yearning for liberty, dignity, and justice for all. Sleep well. The story is told, but its message lives forever. In the morning, when you wake, you will carry something of Spartacus with you, a reminder that courage matters, that resistance is possible, that hope endures. But now, rest and dream. Dream of freedom.